Community Currency with Carol Brouillet, Thursdays at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on the Progressive Radio Network.
I feel this feeling in my heart. I know she knows when it's true. I know she'll tell me where to start, and I trust my heart enough to follow through.
Hello, welcome to Community Currency. I'm your host, Carol Brouillet. Today is December 1st, 2011, and it's part one of a series I'm doing with David E. Martin, who is the chairman of MCAM Incorporated. He also is MCAM is an international leader in innovation, finance, trade, and intangible asset finance. And David has been a real pioneer in global ethical economic development, and he has just an incredible history doing a lot of research and a lot of work in over 120 countries. He's also written a novel that just came out recently called Coup de 12, and he is the architect and founder of the Global Innovation Commons. And so today's show is going to look at technological innovations over time, in particular the Global Innovations Commons, which David founded. And I'd like to welcome you to the show, David.
It's wonderful to be here.
And I think a lot of people don't realize the history of technological innovation throughout the planet, and that there's still so many myths that we've been born sort of under the illusion. I think you're extremely knowledgeable in this area. Do you want to sort of plunge into the history of innovation on the planet?
Well, yes, and what's fun is, depending on how far back you go, Carol, it's actually kind of interesting to try to understand even the birth of the principle of innovation. If you think about something that is essentially a human phenomenon, which is to enter into any ecosystem, any environment, and see things that are surrounding you and decide to use those to either increase your food security or increase your ability to access shelter or increase an efficiency so that your labor is not so hard. You know, in many respects, innovation at its core is something which is an essential component of life and really is beyond just a human experience. It is an essential component of life in a number of ways. What we often find ourselves dealing with is a world in which we have some ambiguity between the words invention, innovation, and incrementalism. And so if you go into innovation and understand innovation, what we think of frequently is trying to understand why, as humans, first of all, we think that somehow or another innovation is the domain that can be somehow enclosed or protected so that it becomes a proprietary enclosure, versus the notion that probably predates at least the last millennial turn, which was a notion that said that we as a species were beneficiaries of kind of a collective awareness or a collective set of developments where the idea of innovation was actually for the betterment of all rather than for the monopolistic interests of a few.
Or the benefit of a tribe or a culture?
Sure. If you think about the wonderful stories that are really just emerging in Western consciousness that have been around for millennia in Asian and Indo consciousness, you realize that there are an enormous number of pieces of creativity, artifacts of creativity, which have been ascribed to a period of time circumscribed really in the last 600 years in Europe and in the Americas, which clearly evidence that significant innovations and technologies were quite prolific, in some cases hundreds or thousands of years before they show up in the West. One of my favorite examples is one of the first evidences of a vending machine, which was a holy water dispenser in Egypt, back in the period of time when some of the temples along the Nile were being built, probably 2,000 years or at least 1,500 years BCE, where we think we've come up with something quite novel and innovative in the 50s, but vending machines and coinage for vending machines was around for probably about 2,500 years before we figured out how to do that. There's an enormous number of artifacts that show us that great innovation, great invention, great creativity has been a companion of the human experience for much longer than we have given ourselves in our kind of current incarnation credit to acknowledge and or the wisdom to include in how we see the world.
Yeah, and there's some books out, 1422, I believe, and 1434, that look at the Chinese Empire and the fleet that circumnavigated the world, mapping it back in the 1400s, that actually helped spark the Renaissance and a lot. And I think they say that the first printed books were actually in China.
Yeah, in fact, many would suggest that the Yongle Empire, which is the empire that commissioned the early 15th century expeditionary forces under a number of efforts both in the Pacific as well as the circumnavigation efforts. A lot of people would say that the Dadian, which was the library of knowable knowledge that was part of the compiled assets of the Yongle Empire, that library, in many instances, appears to have artifacts that were press printed on something that would suggest that Gutenberg, far from inventing a printing press, may have been inspired by looking at pressed pages in Chinese manuscripts that could have predated the Gutenberg press by at least centuries, if not much longer. So there is a human impulse that seems to be tracking with Moore's law, which is kind of both comically tragic and ironic, that the more we think we're innovating and the more we think we're inventing, the sooner we erase the history, which actually makes it clear that we are not what we think we are. And one of the things that I think is real proof of that is when you look at how the myth of Silicon Valley in the United States, the notion that somehow or another these great corporations that started in garages became these phenomenal technology players, the myth of that is actually a myth that has empirical proof that destroys the myth, that is actually not even outside of our lifetime. I recall as a young boy my father being an astrophysicist and an astronomer, and I remember conversations that took place in the 70s where people talked about whose Germans were better, the Germans that were working with Jet Propulsion Laboratories and NASA, or the Germans that were working with the Russian space program. But what was fascinating, even as a young man, is hearing our Germans are better than their Germans, and puzzling over why on earth would we be comparing U.S. Germans to Russian Germans. And it wasn't until later in life that I realized that the reason for that was because if you look at the impulses that funded the great Silicon Valley companies back in the 40s and 50s, you realize that many of these corporations were formed with war reparations, where technologies from the Third Reich were actually reappropriated to benefactors in the Stanford and broader Silicon Valley area. And if you look, something as simple as magnetic tape, which is the anchor tenant for all computer technologies and digital data storage, was a technology developed by the Third Reich so that Hitler could run a propaganda machine where he could run a tape of his voice in one city while a body double was standing on a balcony, and he was in another city to avoid being assassinated.
Whoa,
and so,
I didn't know that.
so we're living in a world where anybody who's gone up and down 101 in California and driven past the Ampex sign, which is still on the highway, very few people realize that Ampex, which is the company from which technologies like Dolby Surround Sound and the Oracle Corporation, where both of those corporations got their start inside of Ampex Corporation, is a company that was created with war reparation technologies that was confiscated from the Germans. And we forget these stories so quickly because they unfortunately undermine the myth that somehow or another we as an American civilization, if you will, somehow have this intellectual and creative supremacy over others. And unfortunately, if you look at the actual data, what you find is that we have relied on the wisdom of others and the innovation of others. And even in the last 30 years, a significant amount of creativity that passes off as American creativity is actually collaborations between American intellects and graduate students from all over the world. So the idea is not that innovation is the sole domain of one civilization or one culture or one academic or one technological space or another, but in fact it is a culmination of collaboration which, if done correctly, really does benefit humanity, and if not done correctly, can enclose solutions from humanity so that we actually find ourselves in worse shape than we would have otherwise been.
Yeah, and I think one of my concerns is like there are some technologies such as nuclear technologies and oil company technologies which have such an incredible negative impact that those kind of technologies need massive funding, and they're actually harmful for the vast majority of people. So there's other technologies. Why aren't they getting the funding? Why aren't those being developed? Who's choosing, which technologies we're going to run with, and thinking about the ethical, environmental, and human consequences of that. And I think that's one of my big concerns. You've looked at how some of the best technologies have been suppressed by the patent system. Do you want to look at?
Yeah, well, Carol, let's take a step back in time and think for a moment about the patent system. If you go back far enough, you realize that the patent system is actually a derivative of a land-based enclosure system, which has its roots that predate the Magna Carta in the 13th century. But the patent system as we know it now is really an innovation of the European Crown land grant and title grant system, where for favors a monopoly or a limited monopoly would be granted to someone who was going to be favored to have an economic interest. The idea, whether it was stained glass in the early UK patent experience, back when Great Britain patented the use of stained glass as one of the first major patents it issued, all the way up to today's technologies where people are patenting all sorts of things. A patent is a very interesting artifact, which is something that we find very fascinating, in that for people who are free market advocates or capitalism advocates, etc., a patent is, in Thomas Jefferson's words, an affront to free and fair markets. The idea that somehow or another you have to give someone a monopoly, which disrupts the normal flow of capital and enterprise, Thomas Jefferson saw as offensive when he was putting the constitutional right to patent in the only right granted, the only property right granted by the Constitution of the United States. If you look at his correspondence, he found the idea of patenting to be an offense, but possibly, in his words, a necessary evil to help stimulate the growth of an emerging agrarian to industrial economy. But he saw it as a compromise to the ideal. And he saw it as a compromise to the ideal because he felt that ideas, creativity, should in fact be free and fair and be transferred as widely and as ethically as possible. And he realized that the patent system would stand in the way of that kind of thing. Fast forward to the early 1980s, and during the first Reagan administration, a very interesting convergence, an unholy alliance was created in response to what was, at that time, something that was thought to be an impossibility. And that was that the Japanese companies were actually starting to patent more than U.S. equivalents of the same companies. So in an area, for example, like solar power, Canon Corporation, and we all know Canon as an image company and as a now digital image company, optics and photographic material and so forth, Canon was one of the great holders of patents on solar cells. What's fascinating about that is Canon was not commercializing these things. And you have to go back and ask yourself, well, why on earth would Canon be patenting solar cells left, right, and center, both in Japan and in the U.S., much of Europe? But they were not doing anything to commercialize them, and to the contrary, Sharp, which is another company out of Asia, was in fact commercializing things that Canon had patents on. And those kinds of mysteries led us down a pathway to try to understand what was going on, because in the 1980s, the response that the Reagan administration had to what they saw was essentially the Japanese land grab of innovation was to liberalize our patent laws so that we started issuing patents not on things that people invented, but on ideas where people did not have to prove that they'd actually figured out how to make the thing work.
You're kidding.
And so, no, in fact, in 1980, from 1980 to 1983, two laws, one was a Patent Reform Act, and one was a law that was called the Bayh-Dole Act. The Bayh-Dole Act was a law that allowed universities to have a patent interest in technologies that were the outgrowth of federally funded research. What happened in a period of time from 1979 to 1983 was work that once was shared publicly in the form of publications and peer-reviewed journals was instantaneously pushed into inventory for the patent system. And so rather than publishing information that was the work of research at universities established a protocol in which their ideas would first be patented. And what that did was from 1979 to 1983, it changed the dynamic of innovation in the United States, where the idea of sharing knowledge, basic research, went from an open and academic exchange to a proprietary enclosure exchange, and that took place in a 4-year period of time.
Wow.
During that same period of time, what we saw was a spike in patent filings where, not surprisingly, significant numbers of patents were filed on things that had no commercial relevance. But much more problematic than that issue was the realization that a number of companies made that if you file a patent on something that you have not developed and you have not invented, you enjoy a very interesting control over the market's ability to access technologies, because as the patent system began focusing not on invention of goods and services, but on the protection of ideas, an enormous number of patents were filed on things that would keep the public from actually ever getting certain technologies. In the Global Innovation Commons, and I know we're going to get to that in the second half of the show, but in the Global Innovation Commons, we literally have hundreds of thousands of patents which were procured by corporations who had no intention of ever bringing those products to market, but rather making it absolutely certain that the technologies would never get to market because there were patent estates that blocked them from entering into the market space. And if you look at very interesting developments in the late 1980s and early 1990s, two things emerged. One was a principle called defensive patenting. And a defensive patent is a patent filed by a company that is actually seeking not to invent or protect something, but to ensure that when they are sued by a third party, they have the ability to say, well, I have that version of a patent, and they go into litigation and ultimately into cross-licensing settlement. The defensive patent, the artifact for legal protection, not for market development, was a pattern that was established. And the other pattern that was established was even more insidious, and that was the principle of what's called freedom to operate on the one side, or blockades from operation on the defensive side, where people would file very large patent estates to ensure that certain technologies never came to life at all. And so whether you look at clean water, you look at carbon alternative energy, you look at fuel cells, hydrogen-powered vehicles, you name it, the largest holders of patents that were filed, issued, and protected over the period of time from 1980 to the present day are held by companies and are developed by companies whose very livelihoods would have been obliterated had any of them ever come to market. And the best part about their strategy is it worked, Carol. Because what happened was, in our society during the same period of time, the early 1980s through the early 1990s, the funding for technologies was increasingly pushed to venture capital firms. And those venture capital firms would ask the question, do you have a patent on the thing that you want to pursue? By blocking patents from ever being commercialized, since they were being held by large corporations with significant market share to lose, these patents went through their 20-year, or back in that period of time, 17-year life cycle. And having never been deployed, having never been used, a very interesting problem with the patent law is that if a patent was filed and never used, the information in that patent can never be patented again. What that means, as very practical reality today, is that if I had a patent and I was Exxon or I was ConocoPhillips and I patented a hydrogen vehicle in 1980, by the year 2000, not only could I keep that vehicle from ever being produced, but I also made it absolutely certain that a funding source that relied on a patent to develop something would never, in any part of history, ever be able to have a proprietary protection around which financing could happen. And by letting the patents get issued and then ultimately expire, what we did was we destroyed the fabric of allowing innovation and proprietary rights to fuel solutions for new economy, new energy, or any of these things. We actually used the system that Jefferson said was a affront to free markets and ultimately secured the fact that our business model, our financial models, and our capital models would never be able to bring to life technologies which were vital for the future of humanity.
But at the same time, it allows people to just use those patents now, these expired patents, and they can create things, but they have to do it in a generic way, right?
Exactly. So what's happened? Right. What's happened is that the incentive that the capital markets relied on and continue to rely on, which is this notion that through proprietary control, you have the ability to control profitability. That business model is, by definition, no longer applicable to all of what is now this open source and public domain technology. In other words, by killing off our creative options, we've also made it absolutely certain that unless we innovate how we do business and how humans engage in business, if we do not innovate that, we will simply not have the solutions which have been with us in many instances for 20, 30, 40 years.
So it was very short-sighted of them to do that, but they were only thinking short-term. Were these companies just completely fixated on the next quarter and maintaining their monopoly power and growing as much as they could and just not thinking of a larger picture?
I think that we can look back and kind of wax nostalgic about what must they have been thinking.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's important to realize that like every other part of our economic history in the U.S., we have had one of the greatest myths of all times, which is the myth of capitalism that is somehow free and independent from socialism or from communism or from any other ism. The fact of the matter is that when an oil company gets concessions or an energy company gets concessions from the government, whether it's a license to operate or whether it's concessions to access resources that are under the ground or under the water, those concessions are proprietary rights, and it's around those rights that people make a lot of money.
Right.
What's fascinating is that the incentive to shift horses is not just the company's incentive problem. Because bear in mind, we have not had a period of the U.S.'s history in which successful businesses are not, at the final analysis, subsidized by preferential procurement or licensing by the federal government. Anybody who wants to argue that we have a capitalist system is clearly ignoring the facts that in every industry it is government procurement, it's preferential financing, and it's proprietary rights that make the winners and losers. And last time I checked, that's not free markets. That's actually manipulated markets.
Right.
If you're going to move from a carbon-based energy system to an alternative energy system, you would actually not just have to get corporations to reform, but you'd have to get the government to reform its incentive system. And right now, what we have is something where it would be nice and convenient for us to say, oh, shame on the corporations. They were bad people doing bad things. But the fact of the matter is, we, the people, have failed to hold our public servants, and I use that term advisedly because I haven't seen many public servants lately, but we haven't held them accountable for the fact that they have reinforced the incumbencies, which have in fact kept us from solving these intractable problems. And so, yes, it's partially the companies, but it's also the public that has failed to inform itself about how the system works, more importantly, how the system doesn't work, and then address that at a public level. And so we see it as an unholy alliance, where the companies acting on behalf of their shareholders, and remember that if you have a 401k, if you have any managed funds at all, you are one of those shareholders, because in virtually every managed institutional account, somewhere in those accounts are companies that are holding technologies back from deployment. Every shareholder's interest is allegedly being served by keeping the incumbent system in its incumbency without having any threat. And a real awakening, both to the facts of that, but also to how do we change, is the core behind what led to the institution of the Global Innovation Commons.
Well, we should probably break now and then go talk about the solutions now that we've sort of recognized, I think the history of the problems, at least partially. I think this is something that people could learn a lot more about. Thank you so much, David. We'll be back in just a few minutes.
Indeed.
I know she knows when it's true. I know she'll tell me where to start, and I trust my heart enough to follow through. I feel this feeling in my heart.
Hello, welcome back to Community Currency. I'm your host, Carol Bruyere, and with me is Dr. David E. Martin, founder and chairman of MCAM Incorporated, and also the architect and founder of the Global Innovation Commons. So the Global Innovation Commons, this is something very new to try to solve the problem of the patent system and allow these suppressed technologies to emerge. You want to tell me more about it, how you recognize the problem, how it works?
Well, yes, Carol. It's what's delightful about the Global Innovation Commons is that if you go back and read the Constitution, which I know certainly since the Bush administration has been an unpopular thing to do. But if you go back and read the Constitution and look at the first section of the Constitution in which patents are authorized, you realize that there is a social contract. And the social contract says that in exchange for information that advances the arts and useful sciences, the public is willing to grant for a limited period of time economic benefit to the person or persons who disclose information that advances, quote, the useful arts and sciences. Mm-hmm. In other words, there's a social contract that says that if you are willing to contribute your creativity to the public benefit, mm-hmm. we're going to give you, in exchange for that, a period of time when you can commercialize that and you get to control some degree of the pricing and the economics around that particular innovation or that technology. Mm-hmm. That social contract has been in breach certainly since the 1980s, when the Reagan administration liberalized the patent laws to allow for defensive patents to be the primary patents that get issued in the United States, where the majority of patents that are filed, there's a study done out at Stanford and another one at UC Berkeley that suggests that somewhere between 90 and 95% of all patents have never been nor will ever be associated with a business interest other than defending from lawsuit. So close to 90% or 95% of all of the patents issued are merely litigation tools. What we said was the social breach of contract, the piece of that contract that said humans were supposed to benefit from the disclosure, needs to be brought back because we need to reclaim the piece of the law that has been forgotten. And I wouldn't say necessarily just forgotten, it's been hijacked. So what we decided to do was to say, why don't we take all of the patent artifacts, every single patent that covers every single technology and things ranging from the carbon alternative energies to public health to agriculture to all sorts of core technologies that we as humans all share a common interest in. And let's take every one of those artifacts and look at them through a couple lenses. The first is to say, which things have been patented and never deployed? In other words, who put up no trespassing signs on land that they never intended to protect? And in the review of that, we found something very interesting, Carol, and that was that we found out that most companies that filed defensive patents did so only in the United States, in some cases Europe, in some cases Japan. Well, what that meant was that the rest of the world actually never had those patents enforced. And all of a sudden, we had a momentary alignment of coincidences, which opened up an enormous prospect. And let me tell you about that event. I was sitting in Coimbatore, India, with the head of science and technology for the country of India. And he had just been lamenting the fact that the Supreme Court of India had issued a ruling, a finding, that accessing water should be deemed a right, that every human being in India should have the right to clean water. Now, you and I can sit there and listen to that and go, well, that makes perfect sense. Mm-hmm. But in India, that was not only an interesting determination, but it presented the director of science and technology with an interesting challenge, which is how on earth can you figure out what technologies would be available to solve problems around water purification in India? Mm-hmm. And he looked at me and he said, is there any way you could help? And lo and behold, all of these wonderful ideas of trying to figure out how to emancipate the technologies which had been protected and taken away from humanity, how to bring all of those into a productive use for the benefit of humanity, showed up in an instant. And we said, well, why don't we do this? Why don't we look at every water purification, water testing, water desalinization technology, and look at every patent that's ever been filed on those technology areas and figure out how many of them are protected in India. Many of your listeners probably don't know, and there is a reason why they don't know, because the United States government has been quite popularizing this theme that countries steal technologies, and that's a big issue that the U.S. government seems to make a big deal about. What's fascinating is in many instances, the technologies that are allegedly stolen are technologies that were never protected because companies didn't think that a country was an overly interesting market, and so they never filed a patent in that country. And you can't steal something that never existed. So a patent on a water technology in the U.S. doesn't mean that patent is enforceable in India unless there is an Indian equivalent of that patent. And for the failure to pay a $3,000 or a $5,000 or a $10,000 application fee, most companies walked away from most countries with most of their technologies. And so what we did was we took all of the patents on water technologies from around the world, analyzed them for those patents which were never protected in India, and created a project called Water for India, which was the first public repository of every single technology which humanity had developed and patented in one place, but had never patented in India. And instantaneously, we provided the government of India with literally tens of thousands of patented technologies which they could engineer into solutions to bring clean water to every citizen of India.
Wow.
In a period of less than 2 weeks, Water for India attracted a lot of people's attention. You can imagine some of them were big fans and friends of what we were doing, and others were less than happy about what we were doing. It turns out that we decided Water for India was a great start, but we decided to do something a little more, and that was, at MCAM, we took the 4 themes, clean water, agriculture, public health with a focus on tropical diseases, and carbon alternative energy, and we expanded the Water for India project to include all of the technologies which we see as fundamental humanity issues, and put all of them in the public domain. And then did one additional thing, and that is we created an interface that would allow a country, if you're Sudan or you're Chad or you're Brazil or Chile or Argentina or Papua New Guinea, you can actually go into the Global Innovation Commons and you can choose your country, and you can see every technology which is available to be used in your country today, including not only every country where that technology can be used, but also a map of every country where a patent is not enforced, into which you can build, buy, sell, transact, or trade. So not only did we emancipate the artifact of innovation, but we also mapped out the commercial partnerships, collaboration partnerships, and other options that are available to bring the ideas that humanity has surfaced into productive use, and then mapped all of that information against the World Bank and the IMF's designations about countries' economic status. And it turns out that the countries that are deemed to be the poorest in the world are actually the most wealthy when it comes to innovation optionality. In other words, if I want to create a generic wind turbine business, or if I want to create a generic desalinization business, the best place for me to go, the best place for me to partner, is in a country that historically has been marginalized. The idea behind all of this is to say that wouldn't it be great if the ignorance of an industrial, established G20 world and the hubris that said that a country like Chad or Sudan or a country like Congo-Brazzaville or a country like Mozambique, which was not a commercially interesting target, wouldn't it be amazing to live in a world where that country actually became the generic supplier of those technologies which really will meaningfully impact and save humanity.
I just wonder about if 95% of the patents are defensive patents and don't actually have useful information on them, how do people in India or Chad or other places go through all those patents and find the ones that are actually useful?
That's a beautiful question, Carol, and let me tell you what happens. There's a beautiful thing that happens when people cheat. When people cheat, they actually cheat in a systemic and systematic way. What they usually do is they take ideas from other people and they manipulate them. In patents, what they do is they change the words. One of our favorite examples here at MCAM is a patent on the Ethernet plug, where in one patent, the patent describes hermaphroditic matable insertable tongues for the purpose of conducting current, which is how a patent describes a plug. And a plagiarism of that patent, which refers to longitudinally upstanding ribs upstanding from an insulative platform. All of these wonderful illusions created by people who are stealing ideas give us the ability to find the source idea. In fact, run the line all the way back to where did the idea come from? And then look at every company, every group, every individual who has decided to take their variation of that thing and do something with it. And what we're doing by running this kind of what we refer to as a linguistic genomics process, which is to go back and find the root of where ideas come from, is first of all to identify the artifact that really does represent creativity. But then in addition to that, look at the number of times that artifact has been manipulated and altered so that when a person in Costa Rica or in Papua New Guinea reads the original artifact and then sees how many different ways that artifact has been used and misused and reverse engineered, what we're doing in that process is giving people not the answers to problems and not the solutions to problems, but we're giving them the opportunity to see how the system has worked to both inform the emergence of a thing, but also to stand in the way of its propagation and use. So it turns out that the artifact of a patent, whether it's true innovation and invention, or whether it's a defensive patent, is actually really less important than to understand the sociologic behavior around that artifact. Because what we want to understand is why is it that somebody would invent a thing and then bury it? And why would several people do the same thing? What is the social behavioral data that you can get from looking at these maps? And so beyond the artifacts of patents and inventions, what the Global Innovation Commons gives us is the ability to map out the who's who, to really identify the parties who have been responsible for standing in the way of things. And moving forward, now you're a country, so you're Brazil or you're China or you're Papua New Guinea or you're Tonga or you're Australia, and you say, listen, you, company X, chose to block this information from being released. Now as a condition of working with us, and Brazil, by the way, is a great example of doing this right now, where Brazil says, if you want to do business with us, you're going to have to transfer real technology. You're going to have to teach us really how to do things. So you're not just showing us a patent and saying, go learn how to do this, but you're using that information as a means to identify the people, the innovation, the knowledge, the information that is important to transfer. So whether you're China, whether you're Brazil, whether you're India, whether you're many, many of the other countries which are in the marginalized state kind of criteria or pecking order, if you think about the G20, if you think about what those marginalized countries now can do, they can specifically say to a company seeking to do business with them, you kept this information from the public. Now we want you to provide it to us. And what is happening with the Global Innovation Commons data is that a number of countries that were thought to be ignorant, thought to be too, quote, backward to understand the technologies, are now asking for things that incumbent multinational corporations never expected to hear. Where all of a sudden countries are being empowered with information and knowledge to ask for the technologies which these companies have sequestered, removed from commercial viability, or actually suppressed for their own incumbent interests. And so it's really critical to understand that what we're doing is taking a system that was broken, that was set up specifically to disadvantage the human experience, and now we're using that very system by moving the fulcrum so that the knowledge is now on the side of the people, to have the people ask for the things that become those necessary steps to move humanity's story forward.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a hard question here, David.
You bet.
In California, they had a lot of innovations in mining technologies, particularly for extracting gold and silver, and it's really been hard on the environment here in California, but that technology has been exported throughout the world, and it's been, I think, devastating to many, many other countries. And people who really understand it realize the argument that, okay, if you have a gold mine here, we might get gold, we might get money, but we're going to destroy our ecosystem. And
correct.
The people don't want it. So how do you, what do you do about the technologies and the patents that actually pose? They might be good for corporations who want to make money and profits, but they're really harmful to the environment. Those are out there too, right?
Phenomenal question, right? Because this goes back to that wonderful question, kind of the Oppenheimer dilemma, which is, a lot of really great physicists and a lot of really great scientists worked together to create something that was really horrific to the human experience.
Yes.
Is that information or is that knowledge something that has no redemptive property? Does it have some redemptive property? Is there a pathway to redeem it? And that is a great question, and the way we handle it is the following. We open our assumption, and this is a statement of, for us, a statement of morals and values. We open our assumption which says an informed humanity typically will make the right decision. Mm-hmm. But an informed humanity must be fully informed. Mm-hmm. Okay? And that second piece, that must be fully informed piece, is where we try to help answer that question. And I'll give you a real tangible example because it's so critical to take the abstraction of your question, move it into the actual grist of something where you can point to it and say, like this. I'll give you an example. In Papua New Guinea, specifically in East New Britain, Papua New Guinea, the Japanese had an enormous amount of technology that they abandoned at the end of the Second World War. Among those technologies are torpedo tubes, very large torpedo tubes, which were made from very high-grade Japanese steel. Those torpedo tubes still are an artifact that lays around the Rabaul Harbor and other parts of East New Britain. By using the Global Innovation Commons to understand how to do essential oil extraction, and by essential oil extraction, what I mean is taking biomass, spices, grasses, things like lemongrass, etc., and getting the essential oils for fragrances out of those things, a group of indigenous communities decided to get together and say, how do we bring value add to our products so that we can sell them in the global marketplace? We use the Global Innovation Commons to understand everything about how essential oils are processed. And to process essential oils, you have to have heat, and you have to have compression, and you have to have pressure gradients, and you have to have all these things. And by looking at the Global Innovation Commons and looking at every piece of engineering of how people have dealt with pressure gradients and oil extraction and distillation and so forth, we sat with the community and did a thing called an integral audit, which is to say, let's look at all of the things that we have and how could we use the things we have to achieve a social benefit outcome. Now, what I'm saying is actually not a hypothetical. This is an actual case where what we did was we took all of the innovation, we took the artifacts, including artifacts around war technology. This is torpedo tube technology. And by looking at it not from how do we weaponize it, but how we use all of the artifacts of the human experience, positive, negative, or neutral, to solve a positive issue, which is how do we make an agriculture product something that can allow the communities to engage in a value-added part of the economic cycle. Mm-hmm. We built the first ever condensation distillation unit for essential oils, and if you look at what is in that particular technology, you'll see that the amazing reality is that we actually have condensers making essential oils made out of Japanese torpedo tubes from the Second World War. Here's the bottom line. The bottom line is a fully informed humanity will not select a pathway, in our estimation, in virtually any case. If they are presented with all the information, their choice to use technology will be for the benefit of humanity. Mm-hmm. And what we've seen time and time again around the world is that most societies in which we work, and we've worked in the majority of countries on Earth, most societies in which we work, when fully informed and fully aware, will choose pathways which even include the demilitarization and de-weaponization of technologies, rather than the alternative. When you talk about a gold technology which extracts gold with high efficiency but toxifies the land, the reason why that technology can be used and deployed and put into commercial activity is because somebody is not disclosing a fully informed sense of the materials or the process to humanity. And our belief and our commitment and our goal is to say, start with a full, fair, and transparent accounting of the knowledge and the information. And humanity will most often make the right decision.
Right. But I think this is what scares me about some technologies, the shadow side, that usually if people are fully informed, of course they can make the right decision, but a lot of times if somebody's trying to work with, say, indigenous people or other people, they sell the shiny side, they don't expose the shadow cost. Like in Silicon Valley where I live, you have groundwater pollution. I mean, it's incredibly toxic. They have the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition, so a lot of times people don't see the shadow side of technologies.
And you're exactly right, and that's the reason why what we're saying is that rather than applying a moral filter to what information we share, our default is to make all information available and then work inside of communities and work with communities to deal with the full information exchange and the full knowledge exchange. So you're right. Information agnostically, which can be used or misused, is something that outside of a human interaction and a genuine sense of purposeful engagement can be misappropriated and misused quite easily. But if you sit down with communities, and once again, remember that every example that you'll find where people accept the shiny side but don't pay attention to the shadow side is where a willful information asymmetry has been designed and has been perpetuated. Humanity has not been blindsided into making bad choices. It has been misled into making a lot of bad decisions and a lot of bad choices. And our commitment and our goal and the framework for what we do is to say that a fully informed humanity is going to, in the main, make great decisions. And where we see information asymmetry, particularly where that information asymmetry is very willful, where a person is taking advantage of the ignorance of others, in those cases and in those instances, there's no question that you're going to find a toxic byproduct of the behavior, of the technology, or of the action.
So I still think one of the biggest challenges we have, too, then is information, communications, because we still have these giant public entities that are not, giving people the full truth, but only giving them a very partial reality.
That's exactly right. And if you look, for example, one of my favorite topics to look at is in the area of potable water, which we all agree should be a fairly equivalent access kind of technology.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the number of companies who have chosen to patent and to protect the world from something that should be an essential human right,
mm-hmm.
and you ask yourself why those companies have done what they've done, you actually, using the Global Innovation Commons, can open up a dialogue that says, what is it about a humanity that says clean water should be restricted to proprietary distribution of technology? And how do you engage in a conversation that starts understanding that if Shell Oil Company, or if Siemens, or if AOS Holdings or Mitsubishi hold patents on clean potable water, why on earth is it that with companies that size, we still have a world in which an enormous majority of the world has limited to no access to potable water? Until you have the ability not only to identify the artifact of innovation, but the organizations and the companies which have chosen to keep these things from humanity, you will only ever address a component of the system.
Mm-hmm.
And what we show time and time again is that by identifying the artifacts of innovation, but more importantly, by identifying the agents of its control, you finally have the ability to engage humanity in a future that allows for innovation to be emancipated.
Well, we've run out of time, I'm afraid, but we will have you back, David, next week. And thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to our technicians at Progressive Radio Network and to Rebecca Cross for our beautiful theme music. And please, everyone, check out the Global Innovations Commons.